Welcome to The Explainer. Today, we're taking a story you probably think you know inside and out, and we're going to completely flip it on its head. We're looking at the ancient, epic narrative of the Exodus, but through a completely new, scholarly lens. To do this, we'll be drawing heavily on the brilliant commentary of biblical scholar Victor P. Hamilton. Hamilton essentially strips away all the Sunday school fluff and reveals this incredible story of political paranoia, deep literary irony, and marginalized women who somehow managed to outsmart the most powerful empire on Earth.
But before we get to all that human drama, I want to start with a question to really challenge your assumptions right out of the gate. Why did God actually rescue Israel from Egypt? If you ask most people, the answer seems completely obvious, right? Well, they were slaves, they were suffering, and God is compassionate. But Hamilton's text forces us to look a little closer.
We so often assume God acted primarily to end their suffering. And yeah, for sure, the text clearly shows God is not indifferent to their brutal enslavement. But Hamilton presents this really counterintuitive theological premise. The primary motivation was actually to fulfill the Abrahamic covenant. God was keeping an ancient ironclad promise made to Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob centuries earlier about giving them the land of Canaan. So the rescue was less about reacting to their present misery and actually much more about honoring a past commitment.
Okay, let's dive into this. Part 1, the true reason for Exodus and the long silence.
To really grasp the cosmic view of this story, Hamilton points out something fundamental that almost always gets overlooked. Before there can be an Exodus, a way out, there absolutely has to be an Isudis, a way into. It's kind of like how you can't get out of debt unless you first get into debt. The entire book of Exodus is essentially the story of how God turns an Isudis into an Exodus, completely changing a going down into a coming up. The stage literally had to be set. So Jacob's family goes down into Egypt, and Joseph eventually dies. But then a massive, frankly terrifying gap of 400 years opens up. For 4 centuries, God goes completely silent. From a brief vision given to Jacob at the end of Genesis, all the way until a burning bush speaks to Moses, the heavens are just shut. There are no prophets, no divine rescue missions, just generations living, dying, and eventually bleeding under the whip of an empire.
Which brings us to part 2, a paranoid Pharaoh's oppression.
We're zooming in from the macro theology of God's silence straight into the paranoid halls of Egyptian power. A new pharaoh arises who does not know Joseph, meaning he flat out refuses to acknowledge the historical contributions of this immigrant group. Remember Jacob's family that originally entered Egypt? The source notes they started as just 70 people, basically a tiny, insignificant clan seeking asylum from a famine. But over the centuries, something incredible happens. They experience this massive, unprecedented population boom. Hamilton points out that the Hebrew text uses words for this growth that are deeply specific. He writes that the use of this verb suggests their growth was, quote, insect-like. The Hebrew word used is sharas, which means to swarm or teem. This demographic explosion strikes absolute paranoia into the heart of Pharaoh. He isn't just looking at a minority group anymore, he's terrified of a massive fifth column that could join Egypt's enemies if a war breaks out. So his solution? He enslaves them to crush their numbers.
Now, there's a profound etymological irony here that Hamilton uncovers. The Israelites are forced into backbreaking labor to build mishkenot, which are store cities for Pharaoh, but by the end of the book of Exodus, these exact same people will be joyfully, freely building the Mishkan, the tabernacle, the sanctuary built for God. The phonetic similarity there is undeniable. The narrative moves from forced labor for a paranoid king directly to willing service for the king of the universe.
Let's zoom in even further to part 3, the midwives' brave rebellion. We're moving from the macro level of systemic oppression down to the grassroots level, focusing on the unlikely heroes who actually fought back against the most powerful man on earth. Meet Shiphrah and Puah. These are 2 midwives, and Hamilton notes they bear Semitic names. Pharaoh summons them and gives a chilling order: execute every newborn Hebrew male. But these women make a staggering choice. They commit treason. They fear God way more than they fear the king of Egypt, so they flat out refuse to comply with state-sanctioned genocide. So Pharaoh hauls them back in. "Why have you let the boys live?" he demands. Their alibi is an absolute stroke of genius. They tell Pharaoh that Hebrew women just aren't like Egyptian women. They're too lively or vigorous, and they give birth before the midwives can even arrive. They completely play on Pharaoh's male ignorance of the birthing process to mask their subversion. They bluff the tyrant right to his face.
And the literary irony here is just delicious.
The title, Pharaoh, literally translates to great house. Because these midwives risk their lives to save others, the text says God established households for them. As Hamilton so perfectly puts it, those who pull the wool over the eyes of King Great House end up with their own houses. The tyrant gets mocked, and the marginalized heroes get rewarded.
This perfectly sets the stage for Part 4, the irony of Moses' rescue.
We're zooming all the way in now, away from the grand palaces and cities, down to a desperate mother, a crying baby, and a small basket hidden in the reeds of the Nile River. Here, we find this incredible linguistic Easter egg that shows just how interconnected these ancient texts are. The Hebrew word used for Moses' small waterproof basket is teba. Do you know the only other time this specific word appears in the entire Bible? Noah's Ark. Hamilton drops this detail to show us that Moses' tiny, fragile basket is poetically and theologically linked to Noah's giant vessel of salvation. Both are meant to save humanity's future from the waters of Beth.
Let's map out exactly how this rescue happens, because the sequence of events is pure narrative brilliance. First, Jochebed hides her baby in the river. Second, Pharaoh's own daughter comes to bathe and finds him. Third, the baby's sister, Miriam, pops out of the reeds and casually offers to find a Hebrew wet nurse. And fourth, the princess agrees. The result? The royal crown ends up paying a Hebrew mother a wage to nurse and raise her own son. You literally can't make this up. The very empire trying to destroy the Hebrews ends up funding their resistance leader.
But, we also really have to give credit to the princess. Hamilton writes, "Not without reason could Exodus 2:1-10 be called the parable of the good Egyptianess." The text notes she had genuine compassion. She didn't just feel pity, she felt with the baby. By taking him in, she is radically and directly undermining her own father's genocidal decree. She sees a human life and chooses it over state policy. So the crucial point is this, and I really want to leave you with this provocative question to chew on. Who actually held the real power in Egypt? We're so conditioned to think it's the pharaohs, the armies, the ones building the giant store cities. But in these opening chapters, the most powerful man on earth, with all his edicts and his paranoia, is entirely outsmarted, outmaneuvered, and undone by a marginalized group of women. Midwives, a desperate mother, a quick-thinking sister, and a compassionate princess. That is the real beginning of the Exodus. Thank you for joining me on this explainer, and I hope this sparks you to look at these ancient texts with completely new eyes.